Hi, I'm Chad with Move for a Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for a Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to show you more major scale 5 chords and how to build them. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free eGuide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this eGuide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. But I am working on it as I'm filming this lesson, so if it's available, a link will pop up on the screen that will allow you to download it. If no link appears, you can look in the description and it'll say whether it's available or coming soon. And if it's not available yet, you can sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a copy as soon as it is available. Also, if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive all updated versions as well. But don't worry, you don't need the eGuide to follow along with this lesson because all of the charts will be on the screen. And also be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day. This is part 4.7 from our series Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So now we're looking at chords that we can build off the 5th note of the major scale, just like we've done with all the other notes. And again, on your screen you can see that I've rearranged everything. The new roots are what were the 5th note of the major scale, but now the 5th note is a root and all these other intervals correspond to this new root. And if we were looking at this as the major scale, this would be the root of the original major scale, and you'd have whole step, half step, and so on from there. But we've started on the 5th note of the major scale just like we've been doing. And then if we put that on one string, you have that right there in one octave. And you know that if you build a triad off the 5th note of the major scale, you get a major triad. You know that if you build a 7th, by adding that flat 7 in there, you get a dominant 7. So if you've been going through these lessons, you already know that. We've already covered that extensively. Now I'm going to show you other options for chords that you can get building off of the 5th note of the major scale. And there's quite a few chords you get from the 5 chord that are also the 1 chord or the 4 chord, can be used as a 1 chord, 4 chord, or 5 chord. And as you already know, the major triad is one of those. That's in all 3 of those categories. It's a 1 chord. It can be used as a 1 chord, a 4 chord, or a 5 chord. The major 6 can be used for any of those chords. So you can get a major 6 starting on the 5th note of the major scale, building a chord off the 5th note of the major scale. You can get a 6 add 9 starting on the 5th note of the major scale, which is also something you'll find as a 1 chord or a 4 chord. Or you can get an add 9. So those are all chords that can either be 1 chords, 4 chords, or 5 chords that we've covered already. And as you know, building a 7th chord starting on the 5th note of the major scale gives you a dominant 7. And that has that flat 7 in there, which is what creates a dominant 7. It's a major triad. Adding the flat 7, you get a dominant 7. And you also know that building a 7th chord off the 1st note of the major scale gives you a major 7th, and building a 7th chord starting on the 4th note of the major scale gives you a major 7th. So the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord are all major triads, but when you get to the 7th, that's the difference between a 5 chord or a 1 chord and a 4 chord, because the 1 chord and the 4 chord have major 7ths in them, and the 5 chord has a flat 7 or a minor 7, as you already know. So any chord that includes the 7th in it is going to be different than the 1 chord or the 5 chord when you're talking about building a chord off the 5th note of the major scale. So then after the dominant 7, which is different, if you take a dominant 7th and add the 9th, then you get a dominant 9th. So that's another chord you can build as a 5 chord, so a chord built off the 5th note of the major scale. And you should remember, as a 1 chord or a 4 chord, you would be taking a major 7th, adding the 9th, that would give you a major 9th. But since the 5 has a flat 7 in it, the 5 chord, you get a dominant 9th instead of a major 9th. Another one is taking the dominant 9th this time and adding an 11, and you get a dominant 11. So that's a root 3, 5, flat 7, 9, 11. And with the 1 chord, we never covered a major 11th because it's not a very common chord and it's pretty dissonant sounding. With the 4 chord, we covered the sharp 11, which is a lot more common. and it's something you can get as a 4 chord with that sharp 11. And then again with 5 chords, adding that 11 is a little more common than doing it to the 1 chord, which would give you a major 11th. A dominant 11 is more common than a major 11th. The next one you can get as a 5 chord is a dominant 13, and that's taking the dominant 9th and adding the 13. That gives you a dominant 13. And with the 1 chord and the 4 chord, we took major 9th chords and added the 13th. That gave us major 9ths. But since we have this flat 7 again, it's called a dominant 13 instead of a major 13. So the most common chords that you can get as a 5 chord that are specific to the 5 chord, meaning you can only get them starting by building chords off the 5th note of the major scale, is the dominant 9th, the dominant 11, and the dominant 13, and the dominant 7, of course. So those are all unique to the 5 chord when you're talking about major scale chords. And that's because of the flat 7 instead of the major 7, and that's where the dominant 7 comes from instead of major 7th. Because anytime you have a major triad and a flat 7 in it, it's some sort of dominant chord. And then again, this diagram, just like we've had, you have the major, major 6, 6 add 9, which are all the same as what you can get with the 1 chord or the 4 chord. But then we have the dominants, the dominant 7, dominant 9, dominant 11, dominant 13. And then how to build each one, the formula, how to build them. And then again, just to be clear, when you're talking about a dominant chord, you would just see the letter name. Right here we're in C, so you'd see a C. And if you're talking about dominant 7, you just see a 7. If you're talking about a dominant 9th, you'd see a C and a 9. A dominant 11, C and an 11. Dominant 13, C and a 13. If you just see the letter name and then that number, the 7, 9, 11, 13, you know it's a dominant chord, because if it was a major 7 type chord, it would say major 7th or have some sort of symbol representing that it's a major 7th. But anytime it's just a letter name and a 7 or a 9, 11, or 13, it means it's a dominant 7th, which means it has a flat 7, not a major 7th. So those are chords you can build starting on the 5th note of the major scale, so 5 chords. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson. I'm actually going to show you how to play a bunch of these like we've done with the other lessons, since there's quite a few that are different from what we've covered so far with all these dominant chords. So go ahead and move on to the next lesson. I'll show you different fingering options for that. And be sure to download the eGuide. All the diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.